Okay, welcome back to Firewall. As usual, I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. With me today is Professor Robert Frank, who's an economics professor emeritus at Cornell. Hey, Professor Frank, thanks for joining us. I've been a fan of your work for a really long time, so it's super cool for me to get to talk to you on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Bradley. Thanks.
So you wrote a really amazing piece, I think it's actually almost exactly a month ago for the Times, called The Economic Case for Regulating Social Media. And it felt to me that you hit on really what kind of has to be the answer to all of this, which is ultimately to eliminate all of the perverse incentives that the platforms currently have. The business has to be via subscription fee. Explain to the listeners, if you don't mind, kind of what you mean by that.
Sure. Right now, the way platforms, especially Facebook, make their money is by steering very finely targeted ads to you, the viewer or the participant. And the way they target those ads is just by watching every move you make over a period of many months, even years. What do you click on? What do you engage with most readily? And by building up a very detailed profile of you, that information is very valuable to advertisers with particular products they'd like to target to the people who are most likely to buy them. So that's how they make their money. And the success of that model increases the more time you spend on their platform. So their incentive, quite clearly, is to get you engaged and keep you engaged. And there's all sorts of interesting psychology about how you do that. I did a piece a few years ago about a very nice book called Addiction by Design. It was an account of the casino gambling industry and in particular the design of the slot machines that turn people into zombies. Only a tiny fraction of people account for most of the revenue that those machines produce. And the companies have hired psychologists who painstakingly refine the designs of them to create what they call a state called psychological flow. That's one of the most pleasurable states known to humans. You just want to be in that state for as long as you possibly can be. And typically the gamblers say they don't care whether they win or lose. A win is important only because it means they have the means to keep playing a little longer. So it's that same set of design principles that the Facebook psychologists have built into the algorithms that they use to steer content to users. They have found that the more outrageous the claim made in the content, the more engaging it tends to be. The angrier they can make you, the more riled up they can make you, the more likely you are to engage and stay engaged. And the unfortunate side effect of their attempt to make money on those incentives is that they've spread all sorts of misinformation and harmful myths about the world very widely and have been now a grave threat to the continuation of democratic conditions around the world.
So tell me why this argument wouldn't work instead, which is, right now, I would say the problem is Facebook, just using them as kind of the placeholder for everyone in this industry, wants consumers to think they can have their cake and eat it too, meaning you can have access to all the different services they provide, and you don't have to pay for any of it, and your data and privacy is safe. That's obviously not true because to the point you made, they make their money by taking your data, monetizing it, and using that for advertisers to reach you in very, very targeted ways. But what if Facebook just said, listen, we're just going to be honest about what this thing is. You don't have to pay anything. You can figure out what your best friend from the 8th grade is still up to and see pictures of their cat, and it will all be free. But we're going to monetize your data because we have to make a living. And if you don't want that, then you can pay a subscription. Would that work, or do you just think that anything other than subscription ultimately is a problem?
No, that would not work, and it's important to understand why. It's not that people wouldn't agree to a proposition like that. People, for the most part, I believe, would agree. Oh, it's fun to get all these services for free. All you have to agree to is they take your data. Well, okay. Think about this example. It's one I cited in the piece you referred to. You're driving along the northbound lane of a freeway. there's been an accident in the southbound lanes. You arrive at the scene of the accident. Should you slow down for a closer look? It's across the divided barrier in the highway. Well, it's going to slow you down by 10 seconds if you do that. On the other hand, you're curious, you want to see what's going on over there with all the flashing red lights. Of course, I'm going to slow down. That doesn't mean that's the right decision for motorists generally in the northbound lanes. If you slow down for 10 seconds, there are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of motorists behind you. That means each of them is going to have an additional 10-second delay. And so the real question is a multi-hour delay a reasonable cost to pay for you to be able to satisfy your curiosity about what's going on in the opposing lanes? And the answer to that question is almost certainly no. What driver would voluntarily submit to a 3-hour delay just to see what was going on the other side? I don't think anyone would. And it's the same with agreeing to these terms. I mean, sure, I'll agree to these terms, but what I'm not taking into account that most of the cost of us agreeing to those terms falls on people other than me. It's a classic externality. It's like the economist's case of smoke belching from a factory. The factory doesn't take it into account because other people bear the burden of it.
So if I tell Facebook, yeah, I want your services, I don't want to pay, do whatever you want with my data, who does that create a negative externality for?
We all suffer when our democracy is weakened. Spreading lies and misinformation and hate speech on social media was a big ingredient in the near total breakdown of our democracy that just occurred 2 months ago. We don't want that to happen. Most people, even the people who contributed most to that, don't want that to happen. They didn't feel like their own individual actions alone made that happen, and they didn't. It was our actions collectively that made it happen.
And so, but why would that risk not still exist if these platforms existed as a subscription model?
Okay, the alternative business model I proposed in the piece was that they not be allowed to sell targeted ads any longer, that the company collect revenue from the sale of subscriptions. The fee wouldn't have to be very large. It would be able to, if you want a social network, you want to be on the biggest one there is. That's why it's hard for competitors to Facebook to emerge in the marketplace, because once they've got the most members, that's a natural monopoly in effect for a social network. Lots of people would want to be on Facebook, even if they had to pay a small subscription fee. And once they've paid that fee, then Facebook makes the same amount of money whether they spread lies and hate speech or socially toxic information on their network or not. They have an incentive just to provide a product that you will like. So sharing pictures of babies and cats and dogs, that's a good draw.
But if I'm willing to pay $5 a month to indulge my anger, paranoia, conspiracy theories, whatever else around politics, would that be prohibited?
Yeah, it's an interesting question of whether further steps would be necessary to prevent the kind of toxic externalities of speech that we're talking about here. The incentives to broadcast those would be greatly diminished under the subscription model, and we could plot a future course after we've had some experience with it. It's possible that there would still be a market for that kind of speech, and it's possible that the spillover effects, the negative spillovers from it, might be severe enough that we might want to consider additional steps to regulate. But I would try the subscription model as a first step.
And what if Congress were to revoke Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act so that the platforms were liable for the comments that their users made on it? Would that also solve the problem, just because all of a sudden the risk would outweigh the reward?
I'm not a lawyer. I've not studied the kind of litigation that you could expect to emerge if that option were followed, but I think it's easy to imagine circumstances where that wouldn't be workable, that the platforms simply wouldn't have the means to monitor what content got posted on their websites to a degree sufficient to shield them from liability.
Yeah. Okay. So let me. This is going to be a weird question, but the example that you used both just now and in the piece about traffic. So I'm someone who, I guess this is pretty embarrassing, but I'm like a behavioral economics kind of like fan. And so, given that, so a while ago, I was the deputy governor of Illinois, and I ran all the state's budget and operations and policy and stuff like that. And I kept trying to make our DOT, Department of Transportation, come up with some system, and the state police, that when there was some sort of accident on a highway, they would put screens up. They would deal with any emergencies and health issues, but then after that, they would put screens up really quickly, with the idea that while people might initially still slow down to see what the screens are, could they see through the screens or around the screens, eventually, if people start to accept, yeah, these screens are up, I can't see anything, that curiosity subsides, and then they're not sort of tempted to slow down, and they keep going. They thought I was nuts. What do you think?
Well, you weren't nuts. That's in fact a brilliant example of a classical behavioral economics policy intervention. It's you've got a situation where the natural incentives favor people making a decision that, all things considered, they would realize is not in their interest to make. How can we steer them towards a different decision? Well, one thing would be to make it against the law to steal a peek over at the opposing lanes, but that wouldn't be practical. It's easy to imagine how hard it would be to enforce a law like that. So a feature along divided highways where a screen could be quickly deployed to block the ability to see traffic in the opposing lanes would be a very low cost and very effective solution to a problem like that.
Yeah, that was my take on it. I eventually got tired of fighting with them and moved on to a different fight. Uh, but I always thought that had a shot. So in your work, quite often, you make the case that we're often our own worst enemy, that we pursue certain goals and behave in certain ways that really aren't in our self-interest, just like in the way that we slow down to look at a traffic accident. What drives the phenomenon, and maybe more important, how do we break it?
My most recent book is called Under the Influence, and it's about how we influence one another, often for good, but painfully often also for ill. So, for example, if you're worried about your kid becoming a smoker, the main thing you need to worry about is the proportion of her friends who smoke. And it's a huge effect. If that number goes from 20 to 30%, she'll become 25% more likely to remain a smoker. You don't want that to happen. No parent wants his kid to grow up to be a smoker. So we have an interest in how many people smoke. If somebody starts smoking, every peer group to which that person belongs now has one more smoker in it. That means every member of every one of those peer groups is slightly more likely to begin smoking or refrain from quitting. And those additional smokers will fan out and influence others to smoke. The real harm you do when you smoke is to make other people more likely to become smokers. And that's not in our interest. Most smokers wish they didn't smoke. The people who don't smoke wish the smokers didn't smoke too. And we finally got around to taxing cigarettes heavily and limiting the places where you could smoke them. And as a result of that, the smoking rate has plunged. It used to be over 50%, now fewer than 14% of adults smoke. That's a great outcome. And the reason we needed to intervene, that didn't happen all by itself, was that nobody worries that if he becomes a smoker, he'll make other people more likely to smoke. You're such a small part of the social environment that you just neglect that second causal error. Sure, the smoking rate influences me, everybody accepts that, but not very many people think about the fact that they too influence the smoking rate. And if we could induce people to act as if they cared about the fact that they influence the social environment, and if the cost of whatever we did to achieve that weren't too great in and of itself, then why not take steps like that? And there are many, many such steps we could take. Taxing harmful behaviors is a very simple step. It's the way economists have long recommended that we curb pollution. And every dollar we raise from a tax on a harmful activity is a dollar less we need to raise from a tax on a useful one. So it's really a win-win proposition.
And so yeah, I worked for Mike Bloomberg at City Hall when he passed the ban on indoor smoking, which was decried as sort of a real curb on personal freedom and liberty. Um, what's the answer when people try to sort of, I say, you should have a nanny state, you shouldn't prohibit or tax these different things, even though they might influence behavior in the right way, and they throw kind of the personal liberty argument at you. What's the best response?
I think my impulse is to turn to John Stuart Mill. He is in history the greatest champion ever of individual liberty. He wrote once that the only justification for telling a person that he can't do what he wants to do is to prevent undue harm to others. His own good is not a sufficient reason. I think Mill wrote at a time when psychology of human behavior was less well understood than it is now. That's a more interesting question probably than he realized. But even if you take his view of the problem as given, you don't have the right to do whatever you please if what you want to do creates serious harm to other people. And so I think it's all
The right to swing your fist is limited to when it touches my face.
yes, and I think people who accept Mill's harm principle often focused only on theft of property, that's harm to others, hitting you over the head with a 2x4, you're not allowed to do that either. But there are many other things we do that indirectly cause harm to others. I mean, think about a steroid consuming sprinter. He's going to increase his times in the 100 meters by about 0.2 of a second. The winning margin in the Beijing Olympics men's 100-meter final that was won by Usain Bolt, 1/100th of a second. So if you've trained for years and have invested all of your effort in a chance to win that race, you're completely out of the running if others take steroids and you don't. So then it's your choice. You can either lose that investment, that's a huge cost to you, that's harm to you, or you can take steroids yourself and then you'll be subject to the kind of serious long-term health risks that we know attend steroid consumption. Either way, you suffer much more harm than if somebody had stolen your bike or hit you over the head with a baseball bat. So yeah, harm to others is a very broad concept. We shouldn't limit it to just those narrow conceptions that many people still focus on.
So in terms of when you talk about how, kind of external factors and events influence individual behavior, how far does that go? I mean, how much are our interests derived from what's internal to us and our personality and our DNA, and how much are we just so influenced by the people around us and the world around us that even things that we think we like are really just a reflection of the culture we're in?
It's in our DNA to pay attention to what other people do and to at least have an impulse to investigate whether you ought to be doing that same thing too. I mean, imagine you see somebody running in panic away from a scene. Your choice then is to sit idly by and risk whatever it is that they're running from causing harm to you, or to somehow intuitively share their panic and run away yourself. I mean, if you didn't have at least an impulse to consider the possibility that running away might be a useful thing to do under the circumstances, you probably wouldn't be very well equipped to make your way in the kind of complex world we confront. I don't know everything I need to know. You don't either, but together people out there know quite a bit about the world. And when we see people doing things confidently, at least you should have an impulse to investigate. Whether you should copy what they do, that's a separate question. You should be careful. You should scrutinize the logic of what they're doing and hold back if what they're doing seems stupid to you. But the fact is, we're not going to stop being influenced by others. And I think because that's true, it's in our interest to take into account the likely ways in which we will be influenced by others. And sometimes we want to encourage those. So it would be great if more people adopted solar panels. What we know is that if somebody installs panels on his rooftop, 4 months later, there'll be a copycat installation. Then another 4 months pass, we'll see those two each spawn a copycat installation of their own. We've got 4 and then 8. After 2 years' time, we've got 32 new installations. So encouraging that first one paid dividends far beyond the individual step that it managed to provoke. It created an avalanche, really. And there are lots of useful opportunities to encourage more behavior like that. And on the negative side, many opportunities to discourage behaviors that are negative influences, smoking just being one obvious example.
You wrote about a decade ago in the journal that your research showed that levying taxes on rich people doesn't necessarily cause them to leave whatever jurisdiction levied the extra taxes. It's become obviously a very timely issue because during COVID, I think something like 5,000 people have left Manhattan alone to move to Florida. Do you think that's still the case, or do you think that regardless of what state capitals do, they're safe because people are going to stay put where they are?
You know, Bradley, there's an old saying, you can't have socialism in one country. If one jurisdiction raises its tax rate, the fear is it'll scare people away. They'll move someplace else. That was actually put to a test. So it would be better if you're going to raise taxes on the wealthy to do it at the national level rather than at the state level. That was done experimentally recently in California. They raised the top tax rate on high earners by 50%. There were predictions that everyone was going to leave. In fact, a Stanford study a few years later showed that the top 1% of earners in California left the state at a lower rate than any other spot along the income distribution ladder.
And so, what is it? Just because those people ultimately have more things that add up to their decision making than purely money? How do they decide?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that environments are very local. You have a life there, you have friends, you have a network. A lot of your success may depend on the very fact of that network. So leaving the network would mean, even though you move to a lower tax jurisdiction, you wouldn't make as much money as you do now after tax. But more important than that is that what we feel we need as consumers is very heavily conditioned by what others in the local environment have. Nobody needs a 30,000 square foot mansion. When the rich all have one, it's a total pain in the ass. You have to hire lots of staff, and you have to worry about tell-all memoirs, all this hassle associated with the bigger properties. If the only reason you need them is that others like you have them, and you couldn't entertain in the style expected of you unless you had one, then it would be actually better for you if all the mansions were 20,000 square feet than if they were 30,000 square feet. So what we know, and it's the very most solidly documented point in this big literature on the determinants of human well-being, is that beyond a point that's long since been passed, you've been in Illinois and New York, long since been passed in every state in this country, further increases in many forms of private consumption just raise the bar that determines how much you feel you need. Doesn't cause any increase in health, happiness, or other measurable forms of well-being. So that's basically money that's wasted. Much better to spend it on green energy sources, on COVID vaccine development, on hospital surge capacity, fixing the broken bridges and roads, all sorts of things that we know would matter to people.
And so, how do you actually fix it? I mean, there's this thing in the human condition that clearly drives people to kind of want more, at least on a relative basis, kind of no matter what they actually need or have. I'll use myself as an example. I've been lucky to make a pretty good amount of money over the last decade or so, and I'm trying to use the vast majority of it for things that I care about. But because I'm in a position to afford whatever I'd want to buy as well, still part of me says, "Oh, I should get a bigger house, or another house in this scheme out somewhere, or whatever it is." Even though rationally I know I don't need it, it probably wouldn't even make me any happier. What is it that makes me still want it anyway?
I was a Peace Corps volunteer long ago. I lived in Nepal for 2 years. I lived in a 2-room house that didn't have any electricity or running water. Never once during the time I lived in it did it seem in any way inadequate. If my Nepal friends would see my house in Ithaca, they would think I was nuts. Why would anybody need such a mansion as I live in? But you wouldn't think that. It's just an ordinary house in the context where I live. There are standards that apply in every location. And if everybody lives according more or less to the same standard, nobody feels deprived. And so if you and others could vote your approval of policies that would steer some of the dollars you're now spending on heavier cars, bigger houses, instead into these other forms of investment that we know would make real differences in people's lives, that would be a good move for you. It's not that you're a bad person, that you feel like the things you need and want are subject to local context. That, everything is contextual. Are we almost there yet? If there's 10 miles left on a 12-mile journey, no, we got a long way to go. If there's 10 miles left on a 120-mile journey, yeah, we're almost there.
Yeah, it's all relative. Let me wrap up with a broader economics question, if that's okay, which is the House yesterday approved the $1.9 trillion stimulus package. Obviously, because of COVID, something like $4 trillion in total has been expended over roughly a 12-month period. Which, look, to me, I'm glad they passed the bill. It makes sense. But are deficits and inflation just no longer, were they wrong by that before and we just were wrong to worry about it? Or are we ignoring a problem? How do you see it?
In principle, deficits are an issue. And the current thinking among economists and policymakers around the world is that they were given far too much weight in public policy decisions a decade ago. What we've learned of late is that the economy can operate at a much higher level without kindling inflationary pressures. And so I think what the conventional wisdom is in the current environment is that we should push. And when we see that we've pushed to the point where we are beginning to bump up against production limits, then that's the time for the Fed to step in and put on the brakes and steer to a gentle slowdown. We're not anywhere near that point yet, and if we're cautious and move slowly now, we're just going to spend many more years at sub full employment levels of economic activity, and we don't need to do that. We can rush up to the full employment level and then slow things down if it turns we've overshot. That's not a hard step to take under the circumstances.
Got it. So they're right to do what they're doing in your view?
I think they're absolutely on target to have done what they did.
Me too. Professor Albert Frank, thank you so much for joining us. It was really an honor.
Great to talk to you, Bradley.